in southern Iraq, where I was right at the end of the first Gulf War, you may remember the terrible road of death, which the Iraqi army tried to escape the wrath of the US in Kuwait. And miles and miles of vehicles of fleeing Iraqi military personnel were blown to bits, but most of the ammunition, most of the ordnance used was depleted uranium. And some of the, you could tell that from, I inspected the one end of this convoy of death, and the holes in the side of armored personnel carriers were those that had been caused by the shells of depleted uranium. I'd seen it elsewhere. Now, right across southern Iraq, depleted uranium was used, and it was used in a way that it could only be, it had to be there for years and years in the future. Southern Iraq, particularly at that time of the year, is a place of the most terrible sandstorms. The sand blows up, it blows into your eyes, your nose, your throat. Everyone is covered with it. People talk about it. It's part of life there, but it's a terrible part of life. And of course it carries all the toxics of warfare, and particularly of depleted uranium. One of the doctors referred to it as the seeds of death. And you can understand why. In the teaching hospital, Sadra Teaching Hospital in Basra, the scene was, well, it was apocalyptic. Mostly children had been affected, because children not only play in these toxic sandstorms, they play on the wreckage of war, and they can pick this up. When you consider, give you an idea, one of the doctors described it, and I think accurately, as a form of nuclear warfare. An A-10 Warhog fires 4,500 grams of depleted uranium in one shot. The United States used 300 tons of depleted uranium in southern Iraq. The Warhog was the main instrument of delivering this depleted uranium. Children all had something they had never seen before, had hardly seen before, and that is neuroblastoma, a particular cancer that is so rare that in most societies it's always a surprise, as one of the doctors said, to see it. But the pediatrician in charge of wards of children, all with neuroblastoma, had a book, a color album of all the children that she treated. I mean, it was quite clear. This of course, is what the researchers call anecdotal evidence. I would call it journalistic evidence, eyewitness evidence. This is the kind of apocalyptic result of that war that was never really reported widely, and has been largely forgotten since then. And the reason it's been forgotten, if I may just add a little more to my answer, Elizabeth, the role of the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization, in fact, when I was there in 1999, 2000, 2001, the World Health Organization completed a report on depleted uranium. By 2001, refused to release it, censored a lot of it. I interviewed Carl Sikora, who was then the British oncologist who was in charge of the WHO's cancer program. And he had printed quite a bit of the damning bits of this report in Lancet, the medical magazine, and was ordered by the World Health Organization to take it out. This has gone on right through to the end of the what I would call the main war, that is 2003, or the initial parts of the main war, when the WHO issued a preliminary report, and then following Fallujah, another report. But all these reports had been doctored. There's so much evidence to suggest this. So depleted uranium, really the effects of it in southern Iraq, where the leading doctor in the Sadra hospital estimated it would affect 48% of the population of southern Iraq, is really like a Chernobyl.
You still have people in the West saying, no, it's basically harmless. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, then you must remember when I first saw it, the so-called sanctions were in place. These were the most, as you'll remember, the most stringent, it's not sanctions, a blockade really, of almost everything against Iraq, that weakened Iraq and prepared it to be invaded in 2003. And Carl Sikora, the oncologist I'd mentioned, he wrote in the British Medical Journal, quote, requested radiotherapy equipment, chemotherapy drugs, and analgesics are consistently blocked by United States and British advisors to the Iraq Sanctions Committee. We were specifically told by the WHO not to talk about the whole Iraq business. The WHO is not an organization that likes to be involved in politics. It's a rather ironic statement at the end. But that blockade was really was crippling a country. It couldn't. That's why the two UN humanitarian coordinators, Dennis Halliday and Hans von Sponeck, resigned. Halliday called it a genocide. But the UN, in effect, the United States and Britain operated this medieval siege against Iraq. So by the time 2003 came around and the Bush and Blair invasion force turned up, Iraq was on its knees.
Do you have any comment on the current lack of real outrage, even from independent journalism? I mean, we have Phil here, but there's not a lot of voices speaking out about this very, stridently, like I would imagine, given the impact of this substance. Do you think that's because people are scared to talk about it in the face of the controversy scientifically?
I don't talk about a lot of things. And that's on the list.
I'm talking about the independent media even. I'm not even talking about corporate media. On the list.
I mean, I sometimes think that those of us doing the work I hope we're doing will one day give up asking why the media do certain things. They are part of the problem, and they are the main instrument of propaganda now. I say that not rhetorically, having come from a lifetime in the mainstream media. They are the instrument of propaganda. All spaces of dissent, of sustained factual reporting on an issue such as this are closed. And that's really the answer to your question, Elizabeth. But also it comes down to why are the universities so quiet about this? So many of the big universities, and I think I know the ones, but I won't name them because I'm not sure, particularly in the United States, were involved in refining depleted uranium. It's a very effective ordnance. It works. In tank battles, it works. It can subdue a major force very effectively. And here we have Ben Wallace, the defense minister in Britain, licensing depleted uranium to go to Ukraine. I think, as you or Joe said at the beginning, that means that we're going to have another Iraq in Ukraine.
Phil, I want to turn to you in your article that you published recently with Declassified UK, where you described Italian courts finding and basically validating this link between exposure to DU, and cancer suffered by service members who were exposed in Kosovo. Can you walk us through that recent piece and what it means for this discussion?
So I've been looking at both the legal reaction to this issue and also the kind of scientific debate which John touched on, and it's interesting that even though among some of the scientific papers there's this kind of degree of ambiguity because of the difficulties of doing long-term studies in war zones, in the legal sphere there are hundreds of court judgments in Europe, mainly in Italy, but also we found one in France and one in England, where judges have awarded compensation to soldiers or soldiers' families after they passed away because of these rare cancers that have developed after their exposure to depleted uranium ammunition. And this is soldiers who were either handling the ammunition themselves or they were being deployed to areas that had just been strafed by NATO. By the US in Kosovo in particular. So I think this is really interesting, and also it kind of, one of the reactions I've had to these stories is, well, who cares if some Russian soldiers get exposed to depleted uranium in their tanks? I mean, this shows that it's Ukrainian service personnel as well who are liable to some of the risks involved in this. There's obviously, of course, friendly fire as well, which has happened in these tank battles. In other conflicts, and then of course the civilian population living in those areas, either when the shells miss their targets and get buried in the ground, potentially by water sources, or just the wrecks of tanks not being cleared away and children playing on them. And the UK has said that they don't feel any moral obligation to help clear up the depleted uranium shells that it sent to Ukraine after the conflict, or to even publish their firing locations. And that's different to with the second Iraq war. The MOD did publish the firing locations, and they did say they had a moral obligation to help clean up. Ultimately, they didn't give much aid towards that cleanup. But I think that the position has hardened even more, and they seem to think that they can get away with it. And going back to 2003. It did feel like there was a bit more pushback from the scientific community. The Royal Society had done some research into the risks of depleted uranium that the MOD and the Pentagon tried to cite as, saying it was low risk. And the Royal Society scientist behind that research actually came out and said to The Guardian, they're misquoting the research. I've said there should be a lot of caution involved, and we need a long-term study to find out what's going on. What's interesting is fast forward to this year when the UK announced it was going to send the depleted uranium to Ukraine. They referred to this same scientific research. They said, the Royal Society said it's fine. And I contacted the Royal Society and said, when did you last do research on this? And they said, well, we haven't updated our research since 2002 or 2003. It's, our position is the same now as it was then. But the rest of the media didn't pick up on that. So I think there are lots of questions that should be being asked about this, and we have perhaps the scientific research, the long-term studies. There are difficulties around doing those, particularly in places like Iraq that are still very unstable. But if you just look at the court judgments, and I'm just talking about courts in NATO states, in Italy, in France, in England. There's other litigation going on, I think, in Serbia as well, regarding the bombardment of Belgrade as well, where lawyers are trying to build on the Italian cases. And I think even in Kosovo, there's some KLA veterans who've fought on the side of NATO, in particular towns that were heavily bombarded, that have expressed concerns about this. So, that's without even getting into that side of it. Obviously anything in the Serbian courts is liable to being dismissed as some kind of Russian propaganda sort of thing. So I just looked at the, Italian courts, French courts, English courts. These are all NATO member states, to see what those judges were saying.
I know that you've also reported on the fact that there's no confirmation that Russia has used depleted uranium itself in the war in Ukraine, although it does possess a stockpile of those types of munition. You've written that James Heappey told Parliament that the Ministry of Defense is unaware of any credible open source reports of Russia using depleted uranium in Ukraine. Can you just tell us a little bit about reporting as well? Because one of the things that I saw a lot in response to the article we published about this subject was people basically saying, well, Russia's using it. And, your reporting indicates that may not be the case.
Yeah, so this was another thing, the reaction to the first story was there was a Russian news agency article from, I think, 2018 saying that they've upgraded some of their tanks to fire depleted uranium. So lots of people were sharing this on social media in response to our story. So an MP asked a question in Parliament saying, does the MOD have any, has Russia used depleted uranium? And I expected them to say yes. And surprisingly, the answer was, we don't have any open source information to say they have done. And something we've seen throughout this conflict is the MOD has been very quick to declassify any intelligence it receives about Russia, using white phosphorus or anything that's perceived as kind of, something that it can call out Russia on. So the fact that they weren't able to produce any instances of Russia actually firing the depleted uranium that it has in its arsenal, again, was very significant, and didn't really get much reaction beyond our article, unfortunately.
And you bring up white phosphorus. I think that's important as well. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? Is there evidence that Russia has used white phosphorus? Because I think that's controversial as well, as far as I'm aware.
So there does seem to be, this recent case in Bakhmut of what looks like white phosphorus being fired. And Ben Wallace gave a statement to Parliament today where he did say, using white phosphorus in civilian areas is illegal. But some of our other research at Declassified has been looking at how Britain fires white phosphorus in Kenya, where it has a military base and it has access to large parts of the Kenyan countryside. And it says that's legal because it's not being fired in a populated area. But I've been to those areas. I've spoken to the Samburu tribe and the herders who frequent that area, and it's a nomadic area. There's no fence around this firing range, so people are just wandering through, and there are real concerns there about the health consequences of that. They've also fired faulty ammunition that hasn't exploded, and then herders have subsequently picked it up or stepped on it, and there've been huge numbers of limbs being lost and people even being killed from that, going up as recently as I think 2015.
The research and the work that Phil has done on this is very important. It's typical of the utter disregard for people's lives, their reaction to the MOD's reaction to whether depleted uranium affects people, that Kenya isn't a populated area or whatever the term used. Like Phil, I know that area. And I was just thinking as he was describing the nomadic area where people come and go, I was thinking of Maralinga here in Australia, where in the 1950s, Sir William Penny and his UK atomic energy people exploded 30 nuclear bombs in the desert at Maralinga, and that was almost word for word the same excuse, that there weren't people there, that they came and went. And of course, that's the nature of the people. They do wander throughout the country in that particular area, and many of them were very seriously affected. But the it is a truly shocking business that the last research, much of which was blocked, as I say, was done around 2003, 2004, unless there's research we don't know anything about. It's interesting that I don't know whether this relates to what Phil was describing, but the only time I think the US and therefore the UK has said that they have actually used depleted uranium was when the Dutch government extraordinarily got from the United States, the Defense Department, the coordinates of the use of depleted uranium in Iraq, and it did so under pressure from the Dutch anti-war group PAX, which had brought in a freedom of information thing, and the British, I understood, went along with that. I'm not absolutely sure about that, but what that showed, what those coordinates showed, was that certainly the US had used it widely all over southern and central Iraq.
I mean, I don't know the exact kind of sequence of events as to how the firing locations came to be published. I think the US were much more reluctant than the UK to release where they had fired their munitions, and of course the US had fired far more. So I think, yeah, we do have a data set of where the UK fired them in Basra in 2003, but I don't think we have the whole picture, and certainly not the US side of it. I mean, with Ukraine, it's these 14 tanks, Challenger 2 tanks that Britain's sending, that will be able to fire depleted uranium rounds, and we don't know exactly how many of the rounds they've given with the tanks. The minister has said they've sent several thousand tank rounds, some of which are the depleted uranium variant, and you know, Germany is sending tanks which fire tungsten rounds instead of depleted uranium. You know, the UK is really kind of an outlier here in its use of the weapon. I mean, together with the US, and actually, I think the UK has found it hard to export its Challenger 2 tanks because it's not a standard NATO type of ammunition, and they're upgrading the Challenger 2 tank to Challenger 3, which will have a different tank turret that won't fire depleted uranium. So I think even in the MOD there is a realization, although they don't like to admit it in public, that this ammunition is, you know, very outdated. I don't think it's been produced for many years now. So this stockpile that's being fired is probably 20 years old or so. So it does look like they're just sort of, you know, giving it to Ukraine to try and use it up in a way. And there are also, you know, conflicting statements, because Ben Wallace likes to kind of ridicule Russia's tank capabilities and point out that they're using you know, tanks from the 1950s and the 1960s because they're getting so desperate. So, you know, that obviously, you know, if they're using such old tanks, then why does Ukraine need such effective rounds to punch through the armor if they're, you know, getting out museum pieces? So that, you know, there are lots of inconsistencies in the MOD's line. It doesn't add up. But yeah, there hasn't been. I mean, I think on this issue, it's probably in the UK, it's had the most kind of backlash. There's been almost uniform support towards the UK government's policy on Ukraine, and this is probably one of the first issues that's made people start to think, you know, whose interests are we really serving here, and if this is going to, you know, spread toxic metals across Ukraine, you know, do we really have Ukraine's best interests at heart here? So I think it started to get people to think a little bit, and then we've had the Pentagon Papers as well, which highlighted more about British troops being on the ground, and, you know, the spy planes over the Black Sea, and how close some of those near misses have been. So maybe, you know, and the war's been going on for over a year now, people might be willing to start thinking a bit more about, you know, whether really they're being given the full picture, and whether this really can only end in one way, or whether a peaceful solution is possible.
It's so typical, Phil, isn't it, for this double story that Russia is this massive threat that has to be opposed to save the free world. And on the other hand, they have this outmoded equipment that they're a joke. They have one aircraft carrier, but they're this big threat. And you also quoted Ben Wallace before saying that white phosphorus was illegal. So why is the use of depleted uranium not illegal? The way landmines or chemical or biological weapons have been banned in UN treaties. Why is there no UN treaty, or why is this weapon not included in some of the previous treaties? Let's say maybe the chemical weapons treaty. Does anybody, either John or Phil, have any ideas about why this is not outlawed? And has there ever been any effort to come up with such a treaty?
Well, I know they've tried at the United Nations, Joe, to get through resolutions that call for updated research. I imagine the kind of research that is needed before a treaty of that kind can be agreed. And it's been blocked over and over again. It had 155. Every 2 years, the General Assembly votes on depleted more depleted uranium research. And every couple of years, the same suspects mount a campaign against it. That's mainly France, Israel, the US, and the UK. I don't quite understand, as I understand that quite recently 155 countries voted yes, then why that isn't a majority and the research doesn't go ahead, I don't know. But clearly that research is needed. Everything, as Phil has said, is out of date. The last papers that we know of, the last WHO papers, are 20 years ago.
John knows more about the backstory to this than I do, but that's my reading of it as well, is that when it's come up at the UN, the UK and countries that use depleted uranium have blocked efforts to ban it or even do research into it. And I mean, we see that in lots of these international treaties that I know from my research into UK archives that they will lobby and try and manipulate different UN committees to ensure a ban on mercenaries is something that I looked at. The UN was trying to pass a ban on mercenaries in the 1980s. The UK was lobbying against that and tried to water it down and kill it, and ultimately didn't vote for it. Fast forward now to where we've got all this concern about the Wagner Group. Well, what's interesting is actually, historically the UK has opposed international efforts to outlaw mercenaries, and obviously Liz Truss has been she supported Brits going out to fight for Ukraine last February, which could fall under some definitions of mercenaryism. So I think these international laws are obviously shaped by the powerful states at the UN to try and protect their interests as much as they can get away with.
There's no doubt, I think, at least amongst us, that this is a very dangerous substance and it causes these illnesses. And I'm going to read in a little bit later from the Department of Veteran Affairs of the United States, where they're basically talking out of both sides of their mouths, and they are saying it doesn't have this effect, but if you feel like you've been poisoned, come and be treated by us. So I want to know whether Russia is, despite that it's certainly a very toxic substance and causes the deformities and the cancers that John was describing. Is Russia going a little too far in describing it as like a dirty bomb? And did it warrant them deploying these nuclear missiles that they will control on the territory of Belarus?
I've not been to southern Iraq and spoken to victims firsthand. I guess it's not the same as a nuclear reaction, a nuclear explosion. It's more of a chemical toxicity issue. But I mean, we know that Russia has been looking for any justification to move these weapons into Belarus. I think they even said in around January this year that if depleted uranium was sent with the tanks to Ukraine, they would see that as a red line and they would retaliate. And then lo and behold, when it came to light, I think in March, that Britain was sending these weapons, the Kremlin very quickly reacted in this way. You could say it's an overreaction, but they had said they would react like that. Mm-hmm. So, why didn't the UK more on the side of caution, particularly when it's only 14 tanks out of several hundred? You wonder what real advantage on the battlefield this is going to give Ukraine. You could just say it's a bit of a PR own goal by the MOD. Is one way of looking at it, but
I think that, I'm sorry, Phil. Yeah,
that's all. That's all.
What you were saying, that there isn't, whether it's a dirty bomb or not. Well, it's dirty in its after effects, and when you consider this, that it uses, in fact, solid uranium. When a warhog fires its 4,500 grams, it's solid uranium. Now, yes, it's a depleted form, but that's very close to a form of nuclear warfare. It has to be. And all the effects, why the revelations of the effects of this on the population are so damning, is that they're very similar, and the word was used over and over again in Iraq. In fact, as I understand it, it appears in the WHO report that was not published, and that's Hiroshima. We have our own Hiroshima. It's certainly a form of that. It's a refined form of nuclear warfare. That's why it's so effective. I mean, if Britain really is serious about sending depleted uranium to Ukraine, it shows, first of all, how desperate they are, rather than this, as Phil has mentioned, this nonsense about broken down Russian tanks. In fact, the tanks being ranged against Ukraine are anything but, and they're worried because the use of depleted uranium certainly sounds to me like a pretty desperate measure, but its effect on the population, no, it wouldn't be instant, but it would soon be evident, the devastation that it would cause in populated areas.